They arrested me on my 62nd birthday, right in front of everyone. It was my daughter who secretly filed the complaint, using fake evidence built from my absolute trust. The police said I had embezzled $21 million. She cried as if she cared, but her eyes told the truth. I stood frozen, still holding the birthday cake. I thought years of sacrifice would mean something. But that day, I saw it clearly. It was all a plan, betrayal, humiliation, and maybe much worse. So I asked myself, if your own daughter ruins you in front of the whole world, how far will you go to reclaim your name? They led me out the front door like I was some criminal mastermind. My neighbors stared from their porches. The kids I used to bake cookies for stood frozen at the edge of the sidewalk. One of them dropped a balloon. I remember that so clearly. A red balloon slipping from his hand and floating up, as if trying to escape the mess I couldn't. The police didn't say much, one on each side of me, my wrists in cuffs. The birthday cake was still on the dining table, untouched. Lemon poppy seed with cream cheese frosting. Miranda had requested it, said it reminded her of childhood. Funny how that worked out. My legs moved on autopilot. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just walked. The charges were already plastered all over the internet by the time I got to the station. Alleged embezzlement of $21 million. Fraud. Misuse of company funds, supposedly over a 10-year period. The details were so carefully crafted I almost believed them myself. They showed me copies of wire transfers, scanned documents with my signature, a list of shell companies registered under my name. It was a paper trail, all right, a clean one. Too clean. Almost elegant. The detective leaned forward like he expected me to confess, but I didn't say a word. Not because I was afraid. I had nothing to confess. I just didn't trust my voice to hold steady, and I wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of watching me crack. They gave me one phone call. I didn't call Miranda. I called Victor. Victor Langford had been my late husband's closest friend, a retired attorney, quiet, methodical, never too impressed by theatrics. He picked up on the first ring, like he'd been waiting, and maybe, deep down, he had. That night in the holding cell, the silence pressed in, thick. I didn't sleep. I sat on the edge of the cot, thinking about everything I had missed. The signs, the late-night phone calls Miranda always stepped away to take, the subtle way she had started asking me to sign things without explaining, the fact that she never wanted me to see the company's financials, even though it was built on my savings. Trust makes you blind, and blindness makes you easy. The next morning, Victor came. He didn't ask if I did it. He didn't offer sympathy. He just slid a legal pad across the table and said, "Start writing everything you remember." I did. Every conversation, every transaction, every holiday dinner where Miranda changed the subject when finances came up. I wrote until my wrist ached. Later, when they moved me to county detention, the guards barely looked at me. 62 years old, first offense, no priors. I was just another file number. Another sad little story to fill a cell. Miranda visited me once, just once. She sat across the glass, tears already smeared on her cheeks. She kept her voice low, trembling, just enough for the guards to hear. She said she was sorry, that this had all gotten out of hand, that she never wanted it to go this far. And then she asked me, with a whisper so sharp I still feel it in my spine, to just let it go, to take the fall, quietly, so the company could survive, so the family name would stay intact. I didn't answer. I hung up the phone between us. She walked out without looking back. If you're still with me, listening, I want to thank you. Because what you're about to hear is not just my story. It's a story about betrayal wearing the face of your own child. A story about how far a woman can be pushed before she decides to push back. And trust me, I did push back. I didn't break that day. I got sharper, more focused. Because while Miranda was busy painting me as the villain, I was already starting to dig through the rubble. And underneath it, I found something she never expected. Proof. But I'll get to that. This is only the beginning. They assigned me inmate number 45109 and moved me to the minimum security wing like I was being checked into a motel. The fluorescent lights in the hallway buzzed overhead. My feet stuck slightly to the waxed floor. A nurse handed me a scratchy grey uniform, and a guard pointed me to my cell. Concrete walls, a metal bed bolted to the floor, a window the size of a shoebox. I sat down slowly and thought, this would be my world now. The first night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. I didn't cry. I didn't talk. I didn't sleep. I listened. The sounds were different from home, but not unfamiliar. I'd lived through enough silence in my marriage to know how to survive it. The next morning, I folded my blanket, cleaned the cell, and stood waiting for my schedule. The guard handed me a clipboard. Laundry duty 3 days a week, kitchen rotation, a weekly visit from a prison counselor. I nodded, said thank you, and walked back to my cell. It was mechanical. I knew how to follow systems. That's what I had done all my life. Raised a daughter, managed a household, helped build a company from nothing. I understood routine. But this time, it wasn't to keep someone else's life running. This time, it was to prepare for something else. Victor called me the next day. He said he was moving forward with the motion to review the financial documents. He was calm, but sharp. He told me Miranda had already hired a crisis PR firm. She had a plan in place, public statements, TV interviews, a full narrative that painted me as an aging executive who lost track of her responsibilities. I didn't say anything for a while. Then I told him to go for the throat. He hesitated, then said, "All right." That was all. Back in my cell, I pulled out the legal pad Victor had left with me. I started writing down names. People who had worked with me. People who had been in our home. Accountants, assistants. One by one, I listed every person Miranda had contact with over the past 10 years. Then I circled the names I didn't trust. There was a rhythm to it. After breakfast, I wrote. After lunch, I organized. After dinner, I reviewed. I wasn't waiting anymore. I was building. Not a case, not a defense, a strike. I asked for the library pass every time it was available. The prison library was outdated, but I didn't need much. Just basic law texts, a few books on corporate structures, and any articles on digital forensics. The librarian, an older woman named Glenda, started noticing. One day she asked why someone like me was so determined. I just smiled and told her I wasn't finished yet. 2 weeks in, Victor visited again. He brought a folder and a grim face. He had requested the original digital files of the company's financials, but Miranda's team claimed the records had been lost in a system crash. Predictable, sloppy, convenient. Victor suspected the backups still existed, but they were likely being scrubbed or rewritten. I nodded. Then I told him something he didn't expect. I had a backup. Years ago, when Miranda started changing our internal systems, I had asked the office assistant to save a full copy of the legacy server to an external drive, just in case. I kept it in the locked storage unit we used for archived documents. I had forgotten about it until that moment. Victor's face changed. I gave him the address, the unit number, and the box label. He left without another word. That night, I slept for the first time since my arrest. The next morning, a new name landed on my list. Charles Benton. I remembered him from a charity gala 3 years back. Slick suit, fake teeth, the kind of man who looked everyone in the eye and no one in the soul. He was the one Miranda kept texting that night under the table. I had thought it was harmless. I was wrong. Victor confirmed later that Charles had been funneling money through real estate holding companies tied to Miranda. The connections weren't clear yet, but the smell was strong enough. I added another page to the pad. Red ink this time. I titled it, Leverage. Miranda had underestimated me. She thought I'd be humiliated into silence, that I'd rot quietly, grateful for her crocodile tears. But I had learned from the best, from my own mistakes, from years of ignoring my instincts to keep the peace. There would be no peace now. I wasn't interested in clearing my name for the public. I didn't care what strangers thought. I wasn't trying to rebuild my image. I was going to break hers. Systematically. Publicly. No screaming. No spectacle. Just facts. Documents. Voices she had forgotten. People she had burned. She thought she had control. But Miranda was sloppy. She didn't account for people who remembered. People like Marla Jenkins, the old bank clerk who retired early after being pressured to process a suspicious transaction. I had seen her once at the farmer's market. She had avoided eye contact. That alone told me there was something there. Victor agreed to find her. Everything was in motion now. I had a list, a pattern, a memory that was sharper now than it had ever been. It was Miranda's move next. But she didn't know something else. I had just begun. I didn't get to see the headlines the morning Miranda went on television. But Victor described them clearly enough. She sat under perfect lighting, in a soft blue blouse, with her hair tucked back just enough to frame her face like she wasn't trying too hard. The backdrop behind her was warm and muted. A vase of lilies, a framed childhood photo of us that she hadn't touched in years. And that voice, gentle, trembling in all the right places, saying just enough to look sincere, not enough to be held accountable. She told the host that this was the hardest time of her life, that her mother had always been a strong, independent woman, that she never expected something like this to happen, that the numbers didn't lie, and she just wanted to do what was right for the company. I could almost hear her rehearsing it in the mirror the night before. Victor didn't add much after that. He knew better. He handed me a stack of notes and told me the external drive had been located in the storage unit. He was already working with a forensic analyst to clone the data. I thanked him, then turned my attention back to the list on my pad. Miranda's media blitz had a clear purpose. She wasn't just managing the story. She was preparing to bury me under it. If she controlled the narrative early enough, there'd be no room for doubt later. I understood. That was how you survived in her world. Get ahead of the truth, make your version louder than anyone else's, and make sure the person you destroy looks like they brought it on themselves. She had always been like that, even as a child. Quiet, but strategic. Her tantrums weren't loud. They were deliberate. She didn't cry when things didn't go her way. She withheld. She measured. She learned how to turn people against each other without raising her voice. Her teachers called her mature for her age. I thought it was strength. Maybe it was. But it was also the beginning of something colder, something I had refused to see. The phone in the common area rang one afternoon. A guard called my name. It was Sophia. I hadn't spoken to her since before the arrest. 17 years old. Too smart for her own good. She whispered her hello like someone might be listening. She told me she had seen her mother's interview. She didn't believe a word of it. She had started noticing things. Receipts that didn't match bank statements, locked cabinets in the study, trips her mother took that didn't make sense. Sophia was observant. Miranda had underestimated that. The girl wasn't nosy. She was quiet. She noticed when things changed, when energy shifted in a room, when smiles didn't reach the eyes, and she had started asking questions. I told her to be careful. I told her not to trust anyone, not even family. She said she found an external drive taped under her mother's desk drawer. She hadn't opened it yet. I told her not to, not without someone she trusted. She promised to bring it to Victor. I hung up the phone with a mix of pride and fear tightening my chest. Sophia was the last person Miranda expected to betray her. That made her the most dangerous. A few days later, Victor returned. He looked tired but focused. The drive from storage had confirmed some of our suspicions. There were transaction logs that had been deleted from the company's current records, accounts created under shell names, transfers routed through Charles Benton's businesses. Nothing damning yet, but enough to widen the cracks in Miranda's story. Then Victor paused. He told me he had tracked Charles's movement over the past 6 months. He had found something odd. A series of unlisted properties in Phoenix and Austin, all under different holding names. But the tax filing linked them to the same IP address. That address had also been used to access the company's payroll system 3 weeks before I was arrested. He leaned forward and said it flat. Miranda had help. The public didn't know Charles. He kept his name out of the press. But behind closed doors, he was everywhere. A financial ghost. He specialized in laundering corporate funds through real estate. He coached people like Miranda on how to vanish paper trails and reappear as victims. Victor believed he had done this before. I asked one question. Who else knew? Victor said no one yet. We would keep it that way. The next piece came from the most unexpected place. A letter. Handwritten, folded into thirds, delivered to the prison by someone who didn't leave a name. The guard handed it to me during mail check. No return address. Just my name in familiar cursive. Inside was a single page. Helena. I never believed she was telling the truth. I remember the day she asked me to push through the wire transfer, said it was routine, said not to mention it to you. I felt something was wrong. I regret not saying anything. I was afraid. Marla. It wasn't enough for court, but it was a thread, one that led to a person, a voice, someone Miranda hadn't silenced fully. I gave the note to Victor. He found Marla living 3 counties over, retired, reclusive, but still sharp. She remembered everything, the dates, the logins, even the strange request to backdate a document. She had kept a personal journal back then, and she still had it. Victor told her everything, showed her what had happened to me, and she agreed to come forward. I marked her name in bold red on my pad, underlined it 3 times. Miranda's fortress was starting to show cracks, and behind those cracks, I could already see the shape of her collapse. I wasn't rushing, I wasn't throwing punches in the dark, I was watching her shadow stretch, and I was stepping right into it. Victor didn't say much when he stepped into the visitation room. He laid down a manila folder and waited for the guard to step back out of earshot before he spoke. The handwriting analysis came back. 3 signatures were confirmed forgeries. One of them was a contract I had supposedly signed, authorizing a wire transfer of $2.3 million to a company registered in Nevada. The name of the company didn't mean anything to me. But when Victor read it aloud, I recognized the initials. They matched a shell company Miranda had mentioned briefly years ago during one of our board meetings. I had forgotten it. She clearly hadn't. Victor kept flipping pages. The forensic team had matched metadata on the scanned files to the same computer that handled payroll and expense approvals. A laptop last seen in Miranda's possession. That was the first real fracture in her wall. Digital fingerprints, clean, cold, unarguable. Still, Victor didn't look satisfied. He leaned back in his chair and folded his hands like he was preparing for something heavier. Then he told me they found more on Charles Benton. More than what they expected. Charles wasn't just laundering funds through real estate. He was also coordinating the movement of capital across multiple accounts tied to foreign entities. Cyprus, Luxembourg, Singapore, places designed to swallow trails. Victor explained that Charles's signature appeared on financial documents for at least 4 of the same firms Miranda funneled money into. I didn't respond right away. I let the weight of it settle. I had known Miranda was calculated, but I hadn't realized how deep she had gone. This wasn't just about stealing money or cutting ties. This was about building a life where I didn't exist. A world she could control entirely. One where I was nothing more than a cautionary tale. I asked if there was a connection between Charles and the company's internal audit team. Victor said not yet, but he was working on it. There was no rush in his voice. He moved carefully, like a man laying traps in a field where snakes already knew they were being hunted. Back in my cell, I rewrote my list again. Not just names anymore. Now I started tracking timelines. Days Miranda was out of town. Nights when certain transfers were made. Victor had sent me copies of the data logs. They weren't easy to navigate, but the patterns started forming. 2 nights after a company gala in New York, 6 figures were moved into a holding account. That same weekend, Charles had posted photos from an event in Paris. Miranda had cancelled her return flight. The pieces fit too easily. This wasn't sloppy anymore. This was arrogance. The next morning, Glenda, the prison librarian, passed me a worn-out book on white-collar crime. It wasn't on the regular shelf. I wasn't sure if she meant to leave it for me, but I took it anyway. I spent the entire afternoon reading about prior cases, how prosecutors built arguments from digital forensics, testimony, and behavioral history. What struck me most wasn't the money or the scale. It was always the relationships. Every one of those stories involved someone who trusted the wrong person for too long. By the time Lights Out came, I had written 20 new pages in my notebook. Diagrams, arrows, relationships. Miranda's entire empire, mapped out by hand from a cell not much bigger than my old laundry room. A week later, Victor came again. He brought someone with him. She looked older than I remembered. Her hair was shorter now, grey at the roots, pulled back in a clip. But her eyes were the same, steady, observant. Marla Jenkins. She didn't sit right away. She stood across from me and said she was sorry. She should have come forward years ago, but she was scared. She had seen the approval come through on her terminal. She remembered Miranda rushing her through a document, told her it was just for quarterly filings, asked her not to mention it to me. Marla still had her journals from back then, her notes, timestamps, even a sticky note Miranda had left on her desk. Victor had already scanned everything. I told Marla I didn't blame her. People protect themselves, especially when they have no reason to believe someone else will. That same afternoon, Victor filed an official motion to include Marla's statement in the review. It wasn't enough to clear me yet, but it was a crack, a real one. And once a crack forms, pressure does the rest. 2 days after that, Sophia called again. She said her mother had been acting strange, paranoid, jumping when the phone rang. She had started locking her bedroom door at night. She moved her files from her home office to a private storage facility and changed the passcode. But Sophia had memorized the old one. She offered to check what was inside. I told her not yet. Victor needed to handle that. We couldn't afford to misstep. But the fear was working. For the first time, Miranda was reacting. She started calling Victor's office, left voicemails accusing him of harassment. claimed I was manipulating people from inside the prison. She even released a statement through her lawyer, implying I had been mentally unstable for years. It was clumsy, it was desperate, and it was public. Victor didn't respond. He kept digging. Meanwhile, I kept writing, reconstructing everything Miranda never thought I'd remember. The lunch meetings, the shared passwords, the subtle shifts in her language, the way she stopped saying we and started saying I. This wasn't about money anymore. It never really had been. This was about erasure, about power, about someone who had been waiting her entire life to flip the story, and she had almost done it. Almost. But almost wasn't going to be enough. Not anymore. Sophia had always been quiet. Even as a toddler, she studied people before speaking. She was never the kind of child who burst into rooms or interrupted conversations. She listened. She waited. She remembered. That made her dangerous, and Miranda had no idea. After her last call, Victor and I agreed she shouldn't go back into the storage unit. Not alone. Not yet. We couldn't risk Miranda finding out. But the fact that Sophia even knew it existed meant we had leverage. I had underestimated my granddaughter, just like I once underestimated the girl her mother used to be. The difference was, Sophia hadn't used her silence to manipulate. She used it to learn. Victor filed for a court-approved investigation into Miranda's company storage units under the basis of potential evidence concealment. It would take days, maybe weeks. But the request itself was enough to rattle the surface. Once official notice was sent, Miranda would know someone was getting close. And based on her recent behavior, she wouldn't handle it well. Back in my cell, I rewrote everything. I started from scratch, new notebook, clean slate. I mapped it chronologically, year by year, transfer by transfer. Who was present, who signed what, who had access. I highlighted every time Miranda had asked me to sign something without explanation. I flagged moments when Charles Benton's name appeared near our meetings or events. I even tracked travel records. Cities Miranda and Charles had both visited within days of company money being moved. There was too much overlap to ignore. One night, while organizing my timeline, I remembered something small. An old email Miranda once forwarded to me. She had asked me to approve a vendor for a side project. The name on the invoice was unfamiliar, but the formatting, the address, the font, it was identical to one of the fake companies Victor had just uncovered. I hadn't signed anything that time. I had refused. Told her I didn't like how it felt. She had shrugged it off, said it wasn't important. I dug through my memory and added it to the board. That refusal may have been one of the only decisions that saved me from being buried deeper. 2 mornings later, Victor returned. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. His shirt was wrinkled, his jaw tight. He dropped a binder on the table, thicker than any he had brought before. Inside were copies of flagged transactions pulled from the legacy system backup I had saved years ago. Miranda's legal team hadn't found it yet. And now, it was being compared against the data her firm had submitted during the initial investigation. There were discrepancies, amounts that didn't match, names that appeared in one file but were scrubbed from the other. According to the analyst, someone had altered the original records and replaced them with sanitized versions. The analyst also confirmed that metadata linked the falsified documents to the same IP used by Miranda's laptop. This time, Victor's voice had weight to it. Not cautious, not calculating. Focused. He told me we were building momentum. We didn't have everything yet. But the pattern was solid. The next step was public exposure. Not just in court, but in the court of opinion. Miranda had painted me as a senile, outdated woman who didn't understand the business she helped build. Now it was time to dismantle that narrative piece by piece. That afternoon, Sophia called again. This time she spoke faster, like the dam had cracked. She had overheard Miranda arguing with Charles over the phone. The words she caught were sharp, urgent. Something about someone talking too much. Something about a judge. Then a mention of Marla's name. It didn't take long for us to understand what was happening. Miranda was trying to silence her. Victor drove straight to Marla's address. She wasn't home. Her front door was ajar, her mailbox overflowing. A neighbor told him she had left town abruptly 2 nights earlier after receiving a phone call that made her visibly shaken. Victor filed a police report, then contacted the prosecutor's office. Within 24 hours, Marla was located in a motel in a nearby town, safe but frightened. She agreed to come back under protective status. That was enough to get the court involved officially. When Victor told me this, I didn't react the way I thought I would. I didn't feel fear. I didn't feel anger. I felt clarity. Miranda had crossed a line. This wasn't just corporate cover-up anymore. This was coercion, threats, interference in a legal investigation. It was exactly the kind of move that exposed the character behind the facade. I told Victor to move forward with everything. No hesitation. Submit the metadata. Submit Marla's testimony. Submit Sophia's observations. Time was no longer something we had to fear. Time had become our weapon. The next day, I received a letter. The handwriting was unmistakable. Miranda's. It wasn't long, just 2 paragraphs. She wrote that she didn't understand why I was turning people against her, that she had always done what she thought was best for the company, that if I continued pushing, I would destroy everything we had built. She didn't mention the lies, the manipulation, the theft. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She demanded silence. I folded the letter and slid it beneath my mattress without responding. That night, for the first time since this all began, I stood in my cell and looked out through the narrow window. I couldn't see much. Just the outline of the fence, the orange glow of the security light, and a sliver of sky. But that was enough, because I knew Miranda felt it. The shift. And whether she was ready or not, the balance had started to tip. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning. It wasn't a trial, not yet. Just a motion to review the integrity of the original financial documents that led to my arrest. Victor said it was the smallest door we could open legally, but once it cracked, it could become a floodgate. He was steady when he said it, but I could see the pressure in his posture. We both knew Miranda would not take it lightly. 2 days before the hearing, the prison allowed me a temporary release under escort to attend in person. It was rare. The motion had drawn enough public attention to justify my appearance. I arrived in a van marked with state corrections and stepped out in front of the courthouse in a grey uniform, shackled at the wrists. Cameras were already in place. Reporters shouted as the officers led me inside, but I didn't look at them. My feet were steady. My back was straight. I didn't come to be pitied. I came to be seen. Miranda was already there, sitting beside her lawyer in the front row. She wore a navy suit and soft curls that made her look younger than she was. She turned her head slightly as I walked past, just enough for her eyes to meet mine. She smiled. A slow, polished smile that told me she still believed she was in control. The judge entered. The room quieted. Victor stood to present the motion, laying out the inconsistencies between the company's current records and the archived backups. He detailed the metadata analysis, the overlapping IP addresses, the altered signature files. He introduced Marla's sworn statement, backed by her dated journals and physical evidence. Then he submitted a sealed declaration from Sophia, noting a conflict of interest, but affirming its credibility. It was methodical, precise, and grounded. Miranda's attorney followed, arguing that the discrepancies were clerical errors, that the metadata could not definitively tie her to the altered documents, and that any statements from employees like Marla were circumstantial at best. He spoke clearly, confidently, and tried to wrap it all in the language of corporate complexity. But it was clear the room had shifted. The judge didn't nod the way she did earlier. She leaned forward, scribbling notes, interrupting occasionally to clarify details. She asked for timelines, for specifics, for explanations that Miranda's team struggled to give. After 2 hours, the judge announced that the motion to reopen the investigation into the original financial records was approved. It wasn't an exoneration. It didn't erase the past year. But it was the first legal acknowledgement that something in Miranda's story didn't hold. As I stood to leave, Miranda caught my eye again. This time there was no smile, no gloss, just tension behind her perfectly composed expression. That was the moment I knew she felt it. The structure she built was starting to tilt. The next afternoon, the press took over. The local news ran a segment on the reopened case, featuring clips from the courthouse steps and interviews with retired employees. One man, a former logistics supervisor, said he had always questioned why the finance team changed so abruptly 5 years ago. Another woman claimed she had signed off on blank checks that later appeared in foreign ledgers. The names were blurred, the voices were altered, but the message was clear. Miranda's narrative had competition now. In the days that followed, more pieces surfaced. A junior accountant emailed Victor anonymously, saying he was willing to testify that Charles Benton had accessed internal systems during off hours using Miranda's credentials. Another former consultant sent over scanned documents showing contract payments that had been redirected to shell accounts without explanation. Every new thread led back to the same web. Charles and Miranda, layers of falsified approval, circular transfers, internal policies bent and reshaped to accommodate decisions that had no paper trail, only whispered instructions. Victor worked fast. He knew Miranda would try to bury whatever else she could. He filed another request to secure company server backups, stored with a third-party provider. That alone triggered Miranda's legal team to respond with urgency. They filed a countersuit, claiming defamation and obstruction. It was a tactic, a desperate one, a wall of noise meant to distract from the growing clarity. In the middle of all this, I received a short message from Sophia. It was passed through Victor. No details, just a sentence. She knows about me. That was enough to stop me cold. Miranda had discovered Sophia's involvement. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the edge of the cot and stared at the floor. My heart stayed calm, but my mind ran circles. Miranda had crossed lines before, but this was different. This was family again. This was the one piece of her world she hadn't yet poisoned. And now it was at risk. The next day, Victor confirmed that Sophia had been pulled from school. Miranda claimed she needed a break, a family retreat. He suspected she had taken her to one of the properties registered under Charles's holding companies, far from media and lawyers. He was already working to locate them, but there were too many unknowns, too many places they could hide. He told me to stay focused. The court was watching now. The press was circling. We were getting closer. I nodded, but something in me had shifted. This wasn't just about clearing my name anymore. It hadn't been for a while. Now it was about stopping Miranda before she burned everything she touched. She built a world on silence, on manipulation, on playing people against one another, while keeping her own hands clean. But she forgot something. Silence doesn't last forever, and shadows don't stay still. Not when the light finally starts to move. The storm finally broke the next morning. Victor showed up with a manila envelope in his hand, his expression unreadable. He didn't sit. He just stood across from me, and slowly laid out the pages on the small metal table between us. There were photos, screenshots, a timeline. One image in particular caught my breath mid-sentence. It was Sophia. She was standing near a white jeep in front of a lakeside cabin. Her face was half-turned, her eyes locked on someone behind the lens. The timestamp was from the night before. A private investigator Victor had hired found them. Miranda, Charles, Sophia, all staying together off-grid in a cabin registered under an alias that Charles used frequently for his real estate flips. Victor said they had been there 3 days already. No security, no movement, no calls to lawyers. It looked like a retreat, but it didn't feel like one. He was convinced Miranda was prepping for escape. But what chilled me deeper was the next detail. Sophia hadn't been allowed to use her phone. The PI had seen Charles take it from her the day they arrived. That meant Miranda knew. She knew Sophia had spoken to me. She knew Sophia had helped us. And now she was trying to disappear with her. I held that photo for a long moment. Then I asked Victor to request an emergency hearing, not for the financial case, not for the documents or the metadata, for Sophia. If Miranda was willing to forge millions, frame her mother, manipulate judges, and bribe entire departments, I couldn't imagine what she would do now that her daughter had become a liability. Victor moved fast. The next few hours were a blur. He filed a protective order for Sophia through family court, while simultaneously petitioning the judge overseeing my case to review the new safety concerns. He also worked with a contact at the sheriff's department to secure a wellness check at the property. But Miranda anticipated us. By the time the officers arrived at the cabin, it was empty. The car was gone. The rental key left on the porch in an envelope with no fingerprints. Inside, nothing remained but used linens, coffee grounds, and a printed map of northern Utah, with a few small towns circled in red ink. She was running. And this time, she wasn't just running from the law. She was running with my granddaughter. Victor tried to reassure me. He said we had the plate number. The Jeep was registered to a shell company tied to Charles. The investigation was now national, with state patrols involved. They wouldn't get far. But his words didn't reach me. I kept seeing Sophia's face, the tilt of her shoulders, the fear in her posture. I knew that posture. I had lived it once when I was young and trapped in a house with a man who never raised a hand, but made sure you never spoke unless spoken to. Miranda didn't just inherit her father's money. She inherited his silencing techniques too. I didn't sleep that night. I sat up in my bunk, replaying every decision I had made, every time I had turned a blind eye. Every moment I convinced myself Miranda just needed time, needed understanding, that she was just stubborn, not cruel, that she was cold but never violent. I had been wrong, and the price was now Sophia. The next morning, the judge granted partial approval for my conditional release. It wasn't complete freedom, but it allowed me to leave under Victor's custody for a 72-hour period to support the emergency search. The ruling cited the complexity of the family situation and the evidence suggesting danger to a minor. Miranda had vanished, but the court had finally accepted that I wasn't the threat. As Victor and I drove north through Wyoming, then into Idaho, the silence between us wasn't empty. It was thick with purpose. I spent the hours going over Miranda's patterns. She never stayed still. She always had a fallback. A plan B. Charles owned a series of short-term rentals under various LLCs. Some weren't even listed publicly. We used those as our new targets. It was at the third property, a farmhouse near the Montana border, that we got the break. A local gas station clerk remembered the white Jeep, said a girl with dark curls came in and asked for help using the landline to call her grandmother, but an older man had stopped her before she could dial. He didn't think much of it until he saw the missing poster Victor had printed. We followed the lead. At dusk, parked under a stretch of pine trees behind the house, we saw them. Charles unloading groceries from the back seat, Miranda pacing by the porch with her phone, and Sophia standing still by the front steps, arms crossed, staring out at nothing. Victor made the call. Within 20 minutes, local police arrived with 2 officers in plain clothes and a family court liaison. Miranda was calm at first, charming even. She said they were on vacation, that I was unstable, that the media had poisoned my family, that Sophia was simply under stress and needed space. But when the officer asked Sophia if she wanted to go with her mother, she paused. And in that pause, everything cracked. She said no. She walked straight past Miranda and took my hand. No one said anything for a while. Miranda didn't scream, didn't cry. She just stood there, mouth tight, eyes hollow, as her daughter, the one person she had always controlled, walked away. Charles was arrested on the spot for obstruction of a court order. Miranda was ordered to appear before the judge within 48 hours. Sophia was placed into Victor's temporary guardianship, pending further custody review. And I, still shackled with court limitations, returned to my monitored residence under the quietest sky I had seen in years. That night, Sophia sat with me on the couch. She didn't say much, just leaned her head on my shoulder. And I knew this war wasn't over. But for the first time, I had won something back. Not money, not property, but a piece of the future. Her. The air felt different when we returned to the city. Even though I was technically still under house monitoring, something had shifted. Sophia was with me. Her presence was quiet but grounding. She didn't ask for much. She didn't speak of Miranda. But I could see her eyes moving across the rooms, noticing every frame, every clock, every book still shelved the way I left it years ago. She was trying to make sense of a place that was supposed to feel familiar, but had been tainted by everything in between. Victor arranged for therapy, a trauma specialist. It wasn't something I ever thought I'd have to consider for my granddaughter. But Sophia surprised us. She agreed to go. No fuss. Just nodded when I brought it up. And the next day, she walked into the office with her head high and her arms crossed like armor. The custody court moved quickly after the incident. The judge had seen enough. She ordered full temporary guardianship to me, and Miranda's visitation was revoked indefinitely pending a criminal hearing. That decision wasn't just procedural, it carried weight. It was the first time the legal system acknowledged the harm Miranda had done not just to me, but to her own child. But Miranda was never one to surrender quietly. 2 weeks later, Victor received a formal notice. Miranda had filed for a reversal of guardianship. In her petition, she claimed mental instability on my part, fabrication of evidence, and psychological manipulation of Sophia. She even included old therapy records from my past, twisting them out of context to paint me as a delusional, obsessive woman holding her child hostage. The timing of it was calculated. She filed the petition just days before the next financial court date, hoping to destabilize my credibility. It was classic Miranda. If she couldn't stop me with silence, she'd try to drown me in noise. Victor wasn't rattled. He expected it. We had prepared for this. But I felt the toll. Even with Sophia safe, even with my truth starting to surface, Miranda still knew how to jab where it hurt. She didn't care about the money anymore. Not really. What she couldn't stand was that her story was no longer the only one being told. We walked into that hearing with boxes of documents, sworn statements, and new financial audits that traced over $19 million back to ghost companies tied to Charles's estate. Most of them were linked to Miranda's real estate ventures and personal spending. Jewelry, travel, private schooling for Charles's distant nephews. Not a dime went toward company debt or charity donations as she once claimed. What Victor presented was a map of theft, a map that stretched across years, cities, and identities. The courtroom was packed, not with press this time, but with people, employees, former colleagues, even a few board members who had stayed silent for years finally showed up, wearing quiet faces that held more shame than judgment. Miranda sat at her table, still composed, still poised, but her fingers tapped the surface with a rhythm that betrayed her. Then came the turn. Victor called Sophia. She had agreed in advance. The therapist signed off. I offered her a chance to opt out, but she looked me straight in the eye and said she wanted to speak. She walked to the front, sat down, and when asked to describe what had happened at the cabin, she didn't tremble. She told the court, in her own words, how she was taken without consent, how she had been told not to contact anyone, how her phone was removed, and how she had been made to repeat lines Miranda wrote about her grandmother being unwell. Her voice didn't break. It sliced. When she finished, you could hear the silence, a kind of stunned hush that happens when a child becomes the loudest truth in the room. The judge didn't delay. Miranda's petition for reversal was dismissed immediately. The court granted an extended guardianship to me with full protective oversight, and the financial investigation was approved for full legal review, with Miranda ordered to submit all remaining records for federal examination. Later that evening, Victor received a tip. A second set of backups had been discovered. Miranda had kept them hidden in a secure cloud server registered to a non-profit organization and she had founded years ago. Ironically, it was a shelter for displaced women. She had used it to hide assets, claiming the donations were anonymous and untraceable. The hypocrisy made me nauseous. We requested a warrant that same night, and within 72 hours, the files were handed over. What we found wasn't just fraudulent, it was devastating. Multiple accounts showed direct transfers from the company retirement fund into private overseas holdings under her maiden name. She had not only framed me, she had gutted the futures of dozens of employees, people who had worked for decades, counting on that money. Victor prepared the final statement. He called it the cornerstone, the one piece that not only proved Miranda's guilt, but justified everything I had done since the day I was arrested. We were ready. But something inside me had changed. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. I wasn't the same woman who had been dragged out on her 62nd birthday in front of her friends and neighbors. I wasn't even the same woman who stood in that courtroom a few months ago, still clinging to the hope that Miranda might come around. No, that version of me had died quietly in the back of that prison van. And the one who remained was no longer trying to save a daughter. She was trying to rebuild a legacy, one that would begin with Sophia and end with justice. The day of the shareholder meeting, the skies opened with a late spring thunderstorm. I stood by the window of Victor's office, watching the rain trace long fingers down the glass. It felt fitting somehow, a cleansing, a quiet warning. What we were about to do wouldn't just expose Miranda. It would undo her entirely. Victor laid out the final files like they were sacred scripture. We had organized every document, every transfer, every forged statement made into a seamless presentation. The entire scheme was traced back to Miranda's manipulation, not just of my finances, but of the entire company's retirement accounts. And now, for the first time in public, she would be forced to face it. The boardroom was already half full when I arrived. I hadn't stepped foot in that building in nearly 20 years. The walls had changed, new faces, new plaques. But the scent of cedar polish and burnt coffee grounds in the corner still clung to the air. It reminded me of late nights with Charles, of building things from scratch, of trust, of belief in family. Miranda entered exactly 5 minutes late. She wore a dove grey suit, tailored perfectly, and her hair was swept back like a sculpture. She moved with precision, scanning the room, reading every pair of eyes before she took her seat. No smile, just that familiar calculation simmering beneath her skin. I didn't look away. The chairman opened the meeting, ran through formalities, then handed the floor to Victor. He stood with calm authority, nodded once, and began. It started slow. A reminder of the company's founding, the contributions of its early employees, the commitment to community. He then transitioned, piece by piece, into the financial trail we had uncovered. Each slide on the screen behind him revealed another layer: offshore accounts, fabricated invoices, charitable donations that never arrived at their destinations. Then he said my name. He reminded them of the arrest, the charges, the conviction, the silence that followed. And then, with the clarity of a blade, he walked the room through the digital audit trail that proved it all had been orchestrated by Miranda. Every eye turned to her. Miranda did not flinch. She adjusted her watch, crossed her legs, the picture of practiced control. Victor paused. Then he handed the final portion to me. My hands did not shake. I stood and walked to the center of the room. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't plead. I told them what it felt like to be betrayed by your only child. I told them what it was like to sit in prison while your name rotted in the headlines. I told them how the people you loved could weaponize your kindness until it became a noose. Then I held up a simple envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter from Charles, dated 3 weeks before his death. A letter he had never mailed, but one that had been preserved by his attorney and only recently resurfaced when Victor dug through a closed estate folder during a review of the old land trust. In it, Charles had voiced concern about Miranda's growing involvement in company finances. He detailed 2 instances of suspicious withdrawals she had made while he was in recovery. He had asked his lawyer to discreetly start separating her access. His final sentence was simple: protect Margaret. If anything happens to me, she needs protection from Miranda. There was no longer space for ambiguity. When I returned to my seat, the room remained still. Then one by one, the members began to speak, some hesitant, some angry, some ashamed. A vote was called. Unanimous. Miranda was removed from her executive role. Her shares were suspended pending legal review. The board filed a formal report to the SEC that very afternoon. But the true fracture came not from the boardroom. It came in the hallway. As the room emptied, Miranda followed me into the corridor, her heels silent on the carpet. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said my name. Not Mother, not Mum, just Margaret. She told me she had done what she had to do, that Charles never saw her value, that I had let him ignore her, and that everything she took was what she was owed. I stood there, hearing the truth laid bare, not as apology, but as entitlement. Then I told her what she never expected to hear. I told her I would not fight her anymore. Not because I was giving up, but because I had already won. Her empire was ashes, her reputation shredded, her assets frozen, her name stained in every circle she once craved to impress. And I still had Sophia. That was the only legacy that mattered. She stared at me, waiting for something else. Anger, grief, regret. But I gave her nothing. Only the silence she deserved. She walked away without another word. Outside, the rain had stopped. The pavement steamed under the sun. And for the first time in 2 decades, I walked out of that building free. 3 days after the boardroom confrontation, Miranda's name hit every business news feed in the country. It began with the official statement from the company then spread like dry grass in wind. Local outlets picked it up, then the nationals, then the international channels, white-collar fraud, forgery, misappropriation of retirement funds, embezzlement through ghost non-profits. The headlines were brutal. Victor had anticipated it. His legal team moved quickly, forwarding documentation to the proper state and federal authorities. What we thought might take months began accelerating within days. By the end of that week, Miranda's bank accounts were frozen. The condo she lived in, the one she had claimed was bought with a private trust from a distant relative, turned out to be part of the diverted funds. Her vehicles were impounded. Her access to business email and internal systems had already been cut, but now even her personal devices were subject to a warrant. The police didn't come with sirens. They didn't need to. They knocked, and when she opened the door, calm and composed, they placed a sheet of paper in her hands and walked her back inside. I received a call from Sophia that evening. Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with disbelief. She had spent years believing her mother's story, that I had made mistakes, that prison had been the consequence of foolish trust, that Miranda had rebuilt the family's name and held it all together. Now she was watching her mother crumble in slow motion. I did not rejoice. I sat quietly on the edge of my bed, looking at the empty teacup on the nightstand. For so many years, I had imagined this moment, that somehow justice would come, swift and righteous. But reality had a colder taste. It did not feel like revenge. It felt like an ending. Miranda posted bail the next morning, but she had no legal right to enter any company-owned property. Her passport was revoked, her travel restricted to within county lines, and her attorneys were scrambling. The retirement fund claim alone carried federal weight. If proven, she faced over a decade in prison. The forgery of documents, including signatures of my late husband, raised additional charges. The shell charities opened a trail that reached 2 states and a dozen fake vendors. I remembered sitting in that prison cell 15 years earlier, head bowed, wrists cold from the metal. And now she knew what it felt like to have strangers measure her life in paper, evidence, and code violations. But it wasn't just the law that turned on her. The court of reputation struck faster. The elite groups she had clawed her way into began removing her from event lists. A grant foundation she chaired issued a quiet resignation announcement. Old college acquaintances who once showered her with praise on social media now unfollowed in silence. Even her fiancé, a corporate consultant with his own clean image to protect, pulled away. Publicly. And still, Miranda held her chin up. She wore it like armor. She never reached out to me. Not once. It was Sophia who became the thread between our worlds. She visited me twice that week, once with Victor, and once alone. Her hands were tense, her posture more rigid than usual. But there was a shift. She no longer spoke of Miranda with certainty. Her questions were heavier, her words more careful. She asked what prison was like, not out of curiosity, but guilt. I didn't sugarcoat it. I told her about the noise, the endless waiting, the humiliation of being searched without reason, the birthdays that passed with no candles, the phone calls that never came. I told her what it meant to lose your name in silence. She listened, and she cried. Not dramatically, just quietly, like someone who finally understood that silence could be the sharpest kind of scream. By the second week, Miranda's lawyer submitted a plea request. They hoped to avoid federal court, to negotiate a deal that would preserve at least some of her assets and reduce sentencing. But Victor's team had already sent a detailed letter to the state prosecutor. We had no intention of backing down. Miranda's choices had not just hurt me. They had robbed dozens of employees. People who worked their whole lives expecting stability in retirement now faced uncertainty. Some were already filing civil suits. The weight of it piled fast. And then came the worst blow. A leaked email exchange between Miranda and her former assistant surfaced. It revealed her knowledge of the forged documents. Worse, it showed her coaching the assistant on how to explain away discrepancies if questioned. The case shifted. Now the prosecutor saw intent, deliberate fraud, coercion. It was no longer about mistakes or mismanagement. It was criminal. Sophia brought me the article on her phone, unable to read past the headline. I read it silently. Then I handed it back. There was no pleasure in it, only confirmation. The fire Miranda started had finally spread to her doorstep. Later that night, I received a letter, not from Miranda, but from her former assistant. Handwritten, 3 pages. She apologized, said she had been afraid, said she was young and needed the job. But mostly she said she had stayed quiet because Miranda promised her everything would stay hidden. She ended with a line that stayed with me. I knew she would fall. I just never expected you to rise. I folded the letter and slid it into the back of my drawer. I didn't need praise. I didn't need vindication. All I needed now was peace. And perhaps, for the first time in decades, I could feel it coming. The courtroom was silent when I stepped inside. Not because anyone knew who I was, not because they expected me, but because I walked in without hesitation. I sat in the 3rd row, right behind the prosecution's table, close enough for her to see me, far enough to make her squirm with the uncertainty of why I came. Miranda arrived 10 minutes later. She wore a dark suit, no makeup, hair flat, tucked behind her ears like a girl about to face the school principal. But her eyes scanned the room the moment she entered. When she saw me, her steps paused for half a second. Then she walked on. She didn't acknowledge me. She wouldn't. I sat through the hearing like a statue, watched her lawyers try to negotiate further, watched the judge deny them with the weight of evidence mounting higher each day. I watched her fold her hands tightly on her lap, pretending not to sweat, pretending the walls were not inching closer with every sentence read aloud. It was not the sentencing hearing. That would come later. But this hearing determined how much of the case would proceed to trial, and every item the judge ruled admissible was another nail in her defense. When it was over, she stood, turned around, and met my gaze. For the first time in nearly 20 years, it was just the two of us again. No lawyers, no headlines, no Sophia, no cameras, just her and me. She walked toward me slowly. People parted. No one said a word. She stopped just in front of my seat. I did not get up. She opened her mouth, closed it, then said my name. Not Mum, not Mother, just my name. I nodded, not in forgiveness, not in kindness, just acknowledgement. She looked thinner, older, as if the truth had carved into her bones. You didn't have to do this, she said. I stayed silent. I would have made it right, she added. Still, I did not speak. She searched my face. Maybe for softness, maybe for rage. I gave her neither. Instead, I stood up slowly. I was not the same woman who had once cried in a prison yard, counting days on her hands. I was not the same woman who sat at the edge of hope, waiting for someone to come rescue her. That version of me had died quietly. This version stood tall, scarred but unshaken. She flinched, then turned, and walked away. That night I went home and sat by the kitchen window with a cup of warm water. Not tea, not wine, just water. I didn't want taste. I just wanted stillness. For all the years I had imagined this confrontation, I had thought I would scream, that I would unleash everything I had buried under obedience and trust. But in that moment, I felt no need. She had already heard the truth, not from me, but from the silence that followed her everywhere now, from the empty house she returned to, from the friends who stopped calling, from the fiancé who returned the ring, from the daughter who could no longer defend her. Sophia had stopped visiting her. She told me so herself, quietly, on a walk near the lake a few days later. She said she didn't recognize her mother anymore, that every conversation felt like another performance, that she needed time to understand what was real. I said nothing, because I understood. I had spent 15 years learning to understand. Later that week, I received a letter. It was from the retirement board. They had reopened their investigation and asked for a formal statement from me. I spent a whole afternoon writing it, not as a victim, not as a mother, but as a woman who had watched everything unravel and rise again. I submitted it the next day. Then I walked home through the park. The leaves had started to change, orange, gold, brown. It was quiet. I sat on a bench and watched a little boy feed a squirrel. His mother watched him carefully from a distance. Gentle, steady. It reminded me of something I had lost, but also of something I had reclaimed. There is a strange kind of peace that comes after a storm you didn't start, but survived anyway. It doesn't sing. It doesn't shout. It just breathes with you. And on that bench, with nothing but a falling leaf for company, I finally breathed with it. I moved out of the old house 2 weeks after the hearing. It wasn't because I had to. The courts had ruled in my favor. The house, the land, the assets under my name before prison were all returned. But I no longer wanted to live inside those walls. Too much of me had been erased there. Too many pieces of my voice left in the corners of rooms where I once whispered trust into people who didn't deserve it. So I packed only the things that belonged to the woman I had become. A few clothes, my late husband's watch, a photo of me and Sophia when she was 6, standing barefoot in the garden, holding hands. I left everything else behind. I found a quiet cottage on the edge of town. Nothing grand, just enough space to breathe. The landlord was a retired nurse who kept bees and wrote letters to her grandchildren every Sunday. She never asked about my story, only asked if I liked the light that came through the east windows in the morning. I said yes. She nodded like that was the right answer. That first morning in the cottage, I sat on the porch with black coffee and watched the fog roll over the field. There was no sound, no headlines, no whispering voices, just silence. It was not empty. It was healing. 3 weeks later, Sophia visited. She didn't knock. She just stood outside the fence, uncertain. I opened the gate and she stepped through. In her hands was a box of scones she had baked. They were burnt at the edges. I smiled. She cried. We sat on the porch and ate the scones anyway. We didn't speak about Miranda. We didn't speak about what had been lost. But she looked into my eyes, and I saw something I hadn't seen in a long time. Remorse. Not for what she had done, but for what she had not done when it mattered most. I told her I was learning to forgive in pieces, that I didn't know if those pieces would ever become a whole. She nodded, said she was willing to wait. The next morning she sent me a text. One line. I see you now. That was enough for me to breathe through the rest of the week. Time did not rewind. It did not repair every crack. But it offered stillness, and stillness offered clarity. I took up walking again, not to reach anywhere, just to remind my legs they still had purpose. At the end of each walk, I'd stop by the community center and sit by the garden. The women there didn't know my story. They knew my name. That was enough. One of them, Joyce, invited me to help with the after-school program for teen girls. She said they needed someone to teach basic budgeting. I laughed, said I knew a thing or two about money and survival. Last Thursday, I stood in front of 5 girls and told them how to protect their names on a contract, how to read every line, how to walk away when the numbers stopped making sense. I didn't tell them where I learned those lessons. They didn't need to know. They just needed to see that I was standing. One afternoon, a letter arrived in the mailbox. No return address. Just my name, handwritten. Inside was a single note. I will never be able to undo it, but I will live with it. I knew it was from Miranda. I folded the note and placed it in the back of a drawer. Not out of hatred, not out of closure, just because some things are better left unread twice. Today, I sat by the lake and watched a bird land on the water without making a sound. The sky was soft, the world quiet. I am not who I was, but I am not broken either. I am someone who survived her own story. And now I get to write the rest of it on my terms. If this story touched something deep in you, if you've ever been betrayed by the ones you loved the most and still chose to rise with grace, this space is for you. Share your thoughts, your silence, your strength. Your voice matters here. Thank you for listening, and thank you for surviving.